All right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour Party has won a decisive victory in the elections in Australia. The Middle East looks to be an issue dividing Australia in the period ahead. Albanese's Labour Party is vague on the Iran issue and supports recognizing Palestinian statehood. The center-right opposition Liberal National Coalition has a firmer stance on Iran in line with current U.S. policy, and the anti-Israel Greens and Teals, the independent Liberals, will be seeking to influence the new government, risking Australia's U.S. alliance and trade stability. How will Albanese balance these pressures, and what is at stake for Australia's security and global role? Joining us to discuss all of this is Mr. Joel Burnie, who is the executive manager at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. In the past, he was the president of the Australasia Union of Jewish Students and worked for the Zionist Federation of Australia. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please note that this broadcast is a pre-recorded session, and therefore we will not be taking audience questions for this broadcast. Now, with all of that out of the way, without further ado, I would like to welcome Joel Burnie. Good to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. Now, to start off the conversation, Australian politics are not something we cover very often at the forum here. And so many of us, myself included, aren't quite as in the know of what happens over on your hemisphere over there. So to start, can you sort of give us a overview of the election over the weekend and what the re-election of Albanese's Labour Party means for both Australia and for its Middle East policy?
So essentially, during the last election, it just wrapped up last weekend, and some of the seats are still being counted. So there's a handful of seats still to be judged. Overall, it is a stunning victory for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and the Labour Party. They have a very much increased mandate in the lower house. The swing towards them was quite clear. So on all of their policies, including on foreign policy, they will be emboldened by their electoral victory, which would assume that they would prosecute their positions, both domestic and foreign, with more confidence and more veracity, given the fact that they believe that they have a political mandate from the population to do it. Specifically on the issues that the Middle East Forum would be interested in, one of the cleavage issues in the election between the incumbent Labour Party and the opposition Liberal National Coalition Party was on Israel. So over the past 3 years, we have 3-year term limits in Australian government. So over the past 3 years, even before the events of October 7, and we covered a lot of this in the last webinar last year, there has been a steady departure from very, very long-standing bipartisan position on Israel. And the way to sort of describe and explain it to a Northern Hemisphere audience is to put things into an American context. Now, when I'm contextualizing it in the American context, there are many, many similarities, but obviously there are some differences. But essentially, the Australia as a middle global power, not as a major power, but a middle global power, has for a very, very long time vis-a-vis global politics and dynamics to do with Israel, being steadfast in its position with the United States. Now, that position is and can be and is regularly very subtly different with the Western European allies, namely Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, France, for instance. So what the Australian government has done over the past 3 years is shifted its global position on Israel from being behind the United States on its positions, mainly illustrated in the United Nations, but it's a more broader problem. And they're shifting their policies to be more in line with the Western European allies, which have a more tempered relationship with Israel and a more pro-Israel light position compared to what the United States has. Now, that shift is quite seismic given the historical bipartisan and unequivocal bipartisan position that successive Australian governments had since the establishment of the state in 1948. The commissioner, the head of the UN body that recommended partition in 1947 was none other than Australian and Labor Party member Doc Evatt. So the Australian nation has had a proud history of being unconditionally supportive of Israel, and that started to shift when this government came to power 3 years ago. Obviously, the events of October 7 made things significantly worse. And my estimation is, with the very large mandate that they have received now, that the drift away from Israel and away from the United States position from this newly elected government will continue in earnest.
Now, to go back to the events of just after the October 7th attacks in Israel, one of the things that I can remember is in front of the Sydney Opera House, very shortly after the attacks, possibly even as they were happening, there were already demonstrations of hundreds of people chanting anti-Israel and anti-Jewish slogans, pro-Hamas slogans. Do you think that the sort of numbers of people who presumably I venture to say would have voted either for Labor or the Greens and Teals, do you think they have always sort of been as out and about and active, or do you think that the events of October 7th really showed everyone who the Australian public really is in this regard?
So this is a very, very good question because at the end of the day, we've had two issues that we've been plagued with post October 7 that come from two different sources. So firstly, you have the departure on the foreign policy front vis-a-vis Israel. So we've just noted that. And that's continued and it's been more progressive as time goes on in a post October 7 environment. However, the other issue that Australian Jews specifically have been facing is not just the departure of their government on the relationship with Israel, but more specifically on the very, very public explosion of anti-Semitism that we've seen on the streets of Australia. Now, the Australian Jewish community on a whole, and as close as to a mathematical consensus as you can get, wholeheartedly believes that you cannot, and I repeat, you cannot divorce the explosion of anti-Semitism on the streets of Australia coupled with the ineptitude of both federal and state governments to tackle it as soon as possible. The Jewish community does not separate the government's position on Israel and its departure from being a very close friend of Israel to their actions in the context of the explosion of anti-Semitism. So the Jewish community couples the two together. Now, you raised the issue of what happened at the Opera House. So that was no less than 48 hours from the invasion, whilst Hamas terrorists were still in Israeli territory, being hunted down by the IDF. Now, there were three very important factors on what happened on that day. The first thing is that they were known to be protests in the streets of Sydney, and the Attorney General of New South Wales, which is the state that Sydney is in, went public and suggested that Jewish people should not go to downtown Sydney to see the illumination of the sails of the Opera House in blue and white. So a sign of solidarity from the Australian people towards Israel in their time of need, the Attorney General suggested for their own safety, Jews should not go to downtown Sydney. One person was arrested on that evening, and that person happened to be a Jewish person with an Israeli flag that refused to be moved on. A number of Palestinian flags and Lebanese flags were in the crowd, but the one sole Jew with the Israeli flag, for his own protection, was arrested because he refused to move on. And finally, and most importantly, is that those hundreds of people that were lighting flares and lighting Israeli flags and chanting, "Where's the Jews? F the Jews, kill the Jews, and potentially gas the Jews," they were doing that whilst witnessed by a number of New South Wales police officers that stood by and watched it happening. That is the seminal moment. Now, going to your question, the explosion of anti-Semitism could not have occurred overnight. It's not as though that anti-Semitism did not exist in Australia on October 6, but then happened to exist on October 7. It could not have been the case. However, through good leadership, and through the pressures of Australian society pushing back against those toxic elements in Australian society, anti-Semitism was neatly put in a box But the events of October 7 and the subsequent failures of both state and federal authorities to clamp down on it immediately not only opened that box, but allowed the problem to fester over a 12 to 18-month period, which started with low-level intimidation of Jews straight afterwards, but it exploded to 12 months and 18 months later with synagogues being burnt down, Jewish leaders' homes being targeted and firebombed, potential terror attacks and mass casualty events targeting Jews. For the past 18 months, since the events of October 7, pigeonholed on the day itself, you had people on the streets of Sydney that were lighting fireworks. Now, this is 3 hours after Hamas came in, and from what we know of what they did on that day, they were still raping, murdering, and massacring people, whilst people in the streets of Sydney, preachers in the streets of Sydney, were lighting fireworks, saying how elated they were. The authorities didn't do enough to protect Australian Jewish people, and the anti-Semitism problem was allowed to fester through inept leadership, through lack of enforcement from police, and still in 18, 19 months onwards, the Australian Jewish community still lives in fear. You've got Jewish students that are being targeted at their school, students being told to remove any identifying materials from their schools showing a Magen David or something like that that identifies them as Jewish. A number of people, and now with the result of the election, and I would suspect that over the next 12 months, you will see Aliyah rates, so Jewish people moving from Australia to Israel, increase in a very, very large factor, because there is a gross uncertainty as to how this newly elected government is going to tackle the explosion of anti-Semitism.
Now, you say that the British, or excuse me, the Australian authorities have done very little. By the sounds of it, it sounds like they haven't done anything at all to protect Jewish communities in Australia. Now,
I just got a point on that. So, look, things got really bad. And once you start having things blowing up on the streets, it does force them to do something. So, in the last 6 months of the term, there was a list of legislation that was passed on various different sectors of Australian society to potentially assist with tackling the problem. They also nominated an anti-Semitism envoy. But here is the crux of the problem. One of the very few recommendations from that envoy is to have a judicial inquiry that was outside of government into campus anti-Semitism. So the same scenes that the encampments that we saw on the campuses in the United States, they were also replicated here in Australia, which made it a very, very uncomfortable and violent environment for Jewish Australians to attend university. And the envoy made a very professional and very worthwhile recommendation for a judicial inquiry into campus anti-Semitism, and the government rejected her proposal. So even the government's own appointee has made recommendations that the government's not following. So there needs to be some type of realignment as to how this newly elected government deals with the Jewish community, and the same goes for us.
now, within, of course, the Labour Party won a pretty decisive victory, it seems. Inside of the Labour Party, are you familiar or aware of anyone in that party who does not believe in the prominent Albanese sort of anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas line? Is there any pushback from within the Labour Party?
I think that you'd have to suspect that there are certain voices, and we know of certain voices. However, when a leader gets re-elected in such a decisive victory, they have the power behind them with the power of the electors to essentially pursue the agenda that they want to pursue. So the previous government has made many, many decisions that we would argue were against the bilateral relationship with Israel and against long-standing bipartisan position on that. However, they kept doing it. So if there are voices, and I'm sure that they're in a minority. There's no doubt that the trajectory of the party is motivated by two factors. One is politics, meaning demographics and numbers of seats that would have pro-Palestinian sentiments where Labor holds those seats. So there's a political element to the positions that they're taking. But most importantly, and more importantly in this second term, because now the politics is not as relevant because they've won, is the ideology. So the ideology of the party has shifted from its position on Israel over a decade ago. So it's not as though that this is a new problem. However, when you have the keys to the car and then you've got the driver in the driver's seat, they get to drive you where they want. So even though it's been a slow burn of a change of their position on Israel, when they've been in power, they've been to act on that. So again, a year before the events of October 7, Australia removed its recognition of West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, that was established when the former government followed the first Trump administration's recognition of Jerusalem. Australia only recognized the western part, which is sovereign Israeli territory under international law and accepted by Australia as sovereign Israeli territory. But my government decided that Israel would be the only country in the world that was unable to choose its own capital and its own sovereign territory. That happened a year before the events of October 7. And in terms of the bilateral relationship, I can go through a whole long list of things that have happened from the day itself on October 7, when my foreign minister tweeted 2 hours to 3 hours after the breach of the fences while people were being murdered, raped, massacred, mutilated. She decided that the best form of Twitter diplomacy, as she enjoys so much, was to call for calm and restraint. That started a chain of events where this government took, let's say, positions that were in conflict with what we were hoping as a Jewish community and as a pro-Israel community that this government would take. The government would claim that it has not departed from the relationship. It claims that it has always stayed within the positions of the bipartisan positions, historical positions. But that is a form of gaslighting to the Jewish community because they have clearly made very, very clear departures. But then to say to us when we complain about it that there's nothing wrong, we don't know what we're talking about, that's the epitome of gaslighting.
Now, the foreign minister in question, you're referring to Penny Wong, is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. So, just to shift focus a little here, to Iran. Penny Wong has emphasized Labor's sanctions on Iran, but seems to have avoided committing to designating the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist entity. With the Labor victory, do you anticipate any shift in this position, or do you suppose that she will continue to resist this designation despite all of the international pressure?
So to be fair on Labor's position vis-a-vis Iran, it's not overly dissimilar to what the previous Liberal National Coalition had on Iran. So I would make the argument, the strong argument, that more could have been done through the 9 years of Liberal coalition governance between 2013 and 2022, including the listing of the IRGC that wasn't done by the previous government and nor was done by the Labor government just in power. And whether or not they'll do it this time around, it's a very good question. On Iran, they have done some good things. They have increased the Magnitsky-style sanctions on individuals out of Iran, and they have targeted some Iranian financial entities under sanction. The issues that the Australian government could tackle immediately in its second term is the behavior of the Iranian ambassador in Canberra has said some very bad things about Israel and the Jewish people that would certainly raise the question as to whether or not his credentials should be rejected and he should be booted out of the country. So that's one soft spot that this current government is not really dealing with. The big question is on the IRGC listing. This current government is utilizing an excuse to say that they have no legal ability to list an organization that is an arm of a sovereign government. So their argument is that the IRGC is an arm of the Iranian government, meaning it's a state-based organ, and because of that, it cannot be listed under the criminal code as a terror organization. Now, there's a very simple way to change that problem and that hurdle, and it's called a legislative amendment, which happens on all pieces of legislation that you require to alter. The instrument of the majority of the lower house and the upper house does and can make many amendments to pieces of legislation. So if you make an amendment to say that you can list organizations that are an organ of a state as terror organizations, if they meet certain thresholds, then they would be given the they would have the legal ability to list the IRGC. So I would suggest, analytically speaking, that then they are using that as an excuse to not to. Now, there are consequences in dealing with the Iranians. So not only do you have the prospect of Australian citizens, either dual Iranian or Australian citizens or Australian tourists being arrested on fraudulent charges and thrown into terrible jails that we all know about. And this happens widely in the Western world. So there's a prize for, well, there's a punishment by the Iranians for government pushback against regime elements. So there will be a price to pay if Australia does list the IRGC. Australia has a diplomatic mission in Iran, in Tehran, and maintains that. I'm sure that the Iranians have threatened the government that if they do list the IRGC, that there will be certain diplomatic consequences, if not further consequences, against Australian dual citizens in Iran. So it's not as though it's look, in summary, I would say that the position of the government could be better on Iran. They have done some good things, and the position of the Australian government on Iran was not just a Labor problem, it was a problem in previous governments. One option is to list compartments, sectors or segments of the IRGC. So instead of listing the whole organization, there is potential to have a discussion to target certain entities within the organization. And the final point is that there is no doubt that nefarious IRGC elements are active in Australia, whether or not that be intelligence assets on Australian universities or any other major spying activities in Australia. They're not the only ones, but they are active in Australia. So I think it's in Australia's national interests, which is the most important thing to analyse when a government should do something. It is wholly within Australia's national interest to list the IRGC as a terror organisation.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. Now, you recently wrote an article just before the election in our Middle East Forum Observer publication. And in that article, you warned that aligning with the radical left policies could strain Australia's relationship with Washington. Now that Labor is in power, how do you assess the risk of this happening, especially if Labor continues to diverge from U.S. policy on the Middle East?
So on the polls before the election, a likely outcome was going to be minority government, where the government failed to reach the threshold of majority seats in the lower house and required the assistance of minor parties, namely the Greens and the Teals, to form a governing coalition in minority. Now, if that was to happen in the hypothetical, the idea would have been that they would have used the Greens in minority government to be able to govern. In that context, the Greens would have demanded a different position on Israel, namely sanctions, the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador, and other punitive actions against Israel. But they also would have challenged the very, very strong and critically important alliance between Australia and the United States. Now, we are well aware of the very large and very important AUKUS deal, which many people are aware of the nuclear submarine part of it, but it's a far broader and more and very detailed strategic alliance between the UK, Australia, and the United States. The Greens Party is viciously against that position. The Greens Party is not a friend of America. It is not a friend of the US-Australian alliance. And had they been put into a position where they were governing in minority with the Australian Labor Party, that would have caused significant problems for Prime Minister Albanese. That problem doesn't exist anymore. So because of the overwhelming victory, we don't have to worry about that. And it's important to note that Prime Minister Albanese is a steadfast supporter of the AUKUS agreement. So I do not see any departure from this government, even after its overwhelming success at the election over the weekend. I don't see a negative positioning on the alliance between the US and Australia. One tension point is Australia's position on Israel. If that position on Israel changes drastically outside of what the United States are comfortable with, and one such example is unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, or changes or further changes or actions at behavior in international forums like the United Nations, I do believe that the Trump administration will make its concerns known to the Australian government, which is something that I don't think happened very often with the previous Biden administration. So if there is going to be a departure from what the United States position on Israel is, and they will want the support of a middle power like Australia that they've enjoyed for such a long time, I think that the administration will gently let the Australian government know of their position and their desire to have Australia in their camp. Whether or not Australia listens, it's up to them. But one potential issue in the alliance between the US and Australia is on Israel. However, my analysis is that Anthony Albanese knows of the importance of the strategic relationship. It goes well beyond a military or defense issue. It goes down deeply into trade and economic partnerships, but it's also cultural as well. We feel closely aligned with the interests of the United States. We fight side by side with the United States in every major war, even before World War One. We're very proud of that history. The United States cherishes that relationship, and I don't see that I don't see any major issues or turbulence in terms of that relationship, given the overwhelming victory that Anthony Albanese had over the weekend. Had he not won in majority, and had he needed the support of the Greens, it would have been far more turbulent than what it is now. He's a supporter of the alliance. He's a supporter of AUKUS. However, I don't think that the Trump administration will sit idly by if Australia continues to sell out Israel.
Thank you. Now, something else you touch on in your article, which, by the way, for our viewers and listeners, I will be linking that article in the video description if you're watching this on YouTube. But something else you touch on is that the Australian elections are typically decided on economic issues, like the cost of living. But with the Labour Party's win, how do you think that Albanese will balance these domestic economic priorities with the divisive Middle East policies and foreign policies that have gained so much prominence?
So there's a few things to unpack there. Historically in Australia, mostly a party will lose an election as opposed to someone winning it. In this context, both are true. So the Liberal Nationals performed poorly because their campaign was full of errors, missteps. That they couldn't catch up on. So they performed very poorly during the campaign, and that's a major reason as to why they lost. However, on the flip side, Labor had a very coherent and well-drilled campaign. They were very diligent in the way that they handled themselves through the campaign, and thus they have had an overwhelming victory. So you wouldn't be able to say, well, it was more that the opposition lost the election as opposed to the government winning it. I think it's a bit of both. So he's riding high. He has the confidence to pursue his agenda. In terms of economics, and in terms of his position on Israel, I think that they will walk a very strategic tightrope. They will, as previously in the former government, they do certain things, but with what they say is quite strategic, well planned, and politically motivated to do one thing and say the other. I think that will continue. I think that you will see the projection of a very strong relationship with the United States. We obviously got hit with a 10% tariff on Australian goods, but the United States enjoys a trade surplus with Australia as opposed to a deficit. So even though that hurt us, we do recognize the fact that it was the 10% tariff was a minimum. And President Trump's comments on Anthony Albanese after his election win are encouraging as well. So I think that they will balance their positions on Israel, which may frustrate some people inside the administration. They will work very hard and studiously to make sure that the friendship and the alliance with the United States is maintained at all costs.
Now, something else that you write about is you note that Australia, or excuse me, that moving away from the Labour Party, that the Greens' outreach to the Muslim vote and Labour's need to reconsider seats with large Arab and Muslim populations. How might Labour's victory reflect their handling of these communities inside of Australia? And will this influence their Middle East policy moving forward?
So again, good question. So the numbers say the following. So in those, there were seats in Western Sydney with a very large Muslim population that coordinated their own Muslim vote party. Very similar to what happened in the UK election last year, and similar contextual sentiments with the Muslim population of Michigan played in the general election in November last year. The idea is that a number of Muslims in Australia that number about 800 to 900,000 they were not happy with Labor's position on Israel because Labor confirmed Israel's right to self-defense and consistently named Hamas as a terror organization and condemned the actions of October 7. They believe that the Albanese government is complicit in genocide. So it turns out that even though, so we have a preferential voting system in Australia, unlike in the United Kingdom, which is first past the post. What that means is that you look at the primary votes, meaning the votes that an individual gets, but then you actually have to rank them and preference all of the candidates in the pool, one to however many candidates are on the ticket. So the preferences flow after the first round is counted, right? So depending on where you sit on the first round and depending on which party you're in, preferences will flow. So in major seats in Western Sydney, there was actually a positive swing towards Labor, which then you could argue that the actions of the Muslim vote party did not have an impact against the Labor Party, which is what they were trying to do. However, if you look at the primary vote of those Labor candidates did decrease a little bit. So all in all, those seats remain very safe for Labor, meaning Labor will clearly say that it's an endorsement of their position, meaning not going too hard on the pro-Palestinian file, but not going too hard on the anti-Israel file. That was the middle of the road that the majority of the Australians wanted and the majority of the Australians agreed with. You have to also understand it's a compulsory voting system here. So the turnout will be around 92 to 93%. It really is a mandate of the people when you have a compulsory voting election. So Labor will argue that because it had an overwhelming victory, that's an endorsement of its positions, both on not going too far on the Palestinian file and not going too far on the Israel file. They will see it as a tick of approval. The other issue is that the Greens Party, so the Greens Party failed dismally, right? They had 4 seats in the lower house. They now have 0. So they've gone from 4 seats to 0, and they made Palestine and Israel a major, major focus, one of the top 2 or 3 agenda items of their campaign. And subsequent to that, even though they only dropped their primary vote by 0.5%, they were unable to retain 4 seats in the lower house, which is a stunning defeat. So you would also argue, both Labor and Australian Jews would argue, that that's a clear repudiation of the Greens' obsession on Israel and also them fanning the flames of anti-Semitism. The Greens are not just an anti-Israel party; they're an anti-Jewish party as well. Okay, so when the explosion of anti-Semitism happened, they did nothing in the legislative scheme to protect Jews, and they did everything on the public scene to fan the flames and to make it worse. So let's just say that the fact that the Greens failed so dismally, the leader of the party also lost his seat, was confirmed yesterday. That's not only a very good thing for Australian Jews, it's also a very good thing for the Australian public.
Now, we're reaching the end here, but just to kind of wrap up, um, in terms of the long-term implications of this election, looking ahead with Labor's policies on Israel, on Gaza, on Hamas, on Iran, now likely to persist, what are the potential long-term consequences for Australia's national security and its role in the Indo-Pacific region as a whole?
A great question. Now, there are many countries in the Indo-Pacific, some with diplomatic relations and some with not, that have very, very close defensive ties with Israel. It is within Australia's national interests to maintain very strong relationships with Israel. Over the past 19 months, since Israel was attacked, Israel was invaded, and the events of October 7 occurred, Israel has nearly single-handedly, but with the assistance of many allies, has strategically changed the whole environment and neighborhood in the Middle East. Hezbollah is no longer the existential threat that it was, a major achievement. Syria has a new regime. The Assad regime is no longer there. The PMUs, the popular mobilization units inside Iraq, are weakened. The Iranians are significantly weakened. The head of the snake is weakened. So, in terms of what's gone on, and also the military threat from Gaza, which was a significant issue for Israel, has not entirely been nullified, but at least the threat of thousands of rockets being showered into southern Israel is no longer a threat. So Israel's been able to achieve that through decisive military means, but also through its capabilities. It has proven that it can and design and manufacture the best air defense systems. The pager attack and then the subsequent walkie-talkie attack in Lebanon essentially tipped the tide and the scale in Israel's favor that it was able to take an existential threat and nullify it, well, at least nullify it to a certain degree. These are the type of friends you want. Friends that are capable of doing these type of things in terms of in the military dimension. These are the types of friends that you want. So I make a clear argument that just given what Israel has been able to achieve over the past 19 months, but also given its friendly relationship with Australia and its true love and unconditional love for not just Australia, but Australians and the Australian people, it is very important that Australia maintains a positive relationship with Israel for our own national security interests. Our friends in the region are going to maintain those defense and military relationships, even in the absence of official diplomatic relations. They understand the importance of maintaining that relationship for their own country's national interests. And it is clear that if Australia was and always was a friend of, and is and always was a friend of Israel, it should maintain that relationship for its own geopolitical and defense and security needs. So I argue very strongly that having a strong relationship with Israel is clearly within Australia's national interest. Hence, on the flip side, anything that degrades or places that relationship in jeopardy, whether or not political or ideological lines, places Australia in a precarious position when we are in the prospect of fighting a very large war in the Indo-Pacific is probable and quite high. Japan is doubling their defense spend. South Korea is increasing their defense spend. India is increasing their defense spend, and the AUKUS relationship is not connected to what Chinese interests are in the region. So if we happen to be fighting a war and a big war, utilizing our flash nuclear submarines that we have and that we purchased at great costs, it makes no sense to me that you would poo-poo a relationship with a friendly nation that had a lot to offer you. Israel is always in a position, due to its love of Australians, to help Australians in need. It will still be there today and it will still be there tomorrow. However, it is clear that it is in Australia's national interest to maintain a strong relationship and alliance with Israel for obvious reasons, and any actions that degrade that or place that in jeopardy is a big problem for Australia's national interests.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, I am afraid we are all out of time for this week's podcast. I want to thank you again, Joel. It's
Thank you for having
always
me.
it's
Always a
always so
pleasure.
insightful to have you. I learned so much each time. I hope to have you back soon again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the interview.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, is there a place where they can go if they would like to follow more of your work?
So we have our website, ajac.org.au, but have a look at our socials. We're big on all platforms, but actually on YouTube, we have one of the largest pro-Israel channels in the world at 232,000 subscribers. So you can see us, search AIJAC Update, and you'll be able to subscribe and like our social media page. So we're not only creating Australian-based content with our staff and with our own infrastructure, we're also disseminating a lot of different stuff from around the world. So that's AJAC Update on all of the major platforms: Instagram, Facebook, X, and of course YouTube.
All right, fantastic. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, those will all be linked in the video description below. So feel free to go click into those and subscribe and check out those pages. For our viewers and listeners, I want to thank you as well for your participation and your viewership. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.